Tonight is the night he dies. I heard someone say behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, and I remember thinking how a sentence like that can sound almost ordinary when it doesn't belong to your life yet. The stainless steel counters of the restaurant were too bright under the heat lamps, the air thick with the smell of butter, garlic, and expensive wine being opened far too early for a Tuesday night. I was 26, working a double shift at the Emerson Room in downtown Chicago, balancing trays and smiling at people who never really saw me, the kind of place where every table looked like it had a secret they were paying extra to keep quiet. That night, the first shift had already drained me, but I stayed because rent doesn't care if you're tired, and neither do student loans. Then the atmosphere changed the way it always did right before something important happened, like the room itself was holding its breath. The front doors opened without ceremony, and Dylan Carter walked in. I had seen powerful men before, wealthy men, loud men, men who wanted attention like it was something they could buy, but Dylan was different. He didn't ask the room to notice him. The room adjusted itself around him without permission. Conversations lowered, glasses paused midair, even the staff moved with quieter steps, as if sound itself had become optional. He wore a dark tailored suit, no visible jewelry, no unnecessary display, but everything about him suggested control that didn't need decoration. He sat at the private table in the back with two of his associates, not speaking much, just observing, like he was measuring the entire room in silence. That was when I noticed her. Vanessa Reed. She arrived 20 minutes later, dressed too perfectly for a casual dinner, smiling too smoothly, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize joined her at the corner table near the glass wall. They leaned in close, speaking in low tones that didn't match the relaxed atmosphere they were pretending to exist in. I wasn't supposed to pay attention. Waitresses learn quickly that curiosity is expensive, but something about the way Vanessa kept checking Dylan's table pulled my focus anyway. I moved closer to refill a water glass at a nearby table, pretending not to listen, but I caught fragments of their conversation, words like timing, access, and tonight. The man with her slid a small folded napkin across the table, and she nodded once, sharp and certain, like a decision had already been made before she ever walked into the room. My stomach tightened, not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough. I had worked here long enough to recognize when people weren't talking about dinner. Then I saw it. Vanessa's hand subtly adjusting a ring on her finger, a small, deliberate motion that didn't belong in casual conversation. She glanced again toward Dylan, and for a split second her expression changed. Not fear, not hesitation, but calculation. That was the moment I realized something was wrong, not in a vague, anxious way, but in a way that made every instinct I had learned from growing up in a city like this turn sharply alert. I shouldn't have done anything. People like me don't interrupt worlds like his. But I thought about the sentence I heard earlier again, and about how easily silence can become permission. So I tore a small piece from my order pad, my hands steady in a way my thoughts weren't, and I wrote quickly, barely breathing as I forced the words into something simple enough to survive misunderstanding. Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position. I folded it once. Then again. My pulse was loud in my ears as I walked toward Dylan Carter's table, pretending I was only doing my job, pretending the weight in my hand was nothing more than paper. When I reached him, I didn't stop moving. I placed the folded note beside his glass as if it belonged there, as if it was part of the service, and I kept walking without looking back. But I felt it, his attention shifting instantly, sharp and absolute, locking onto the space I had just left, and for the first time that night, I understood I was no longer just serving tables. I was standing inside something I had no name for yet. The moment I turned away from his table, I felt it instead of seeing it, a shift in the air. So subtle it was almost like the room itself had exhaled differently. I kept walking toward the kitchen pass, forcing my steps to stay normal, forcing my hands not to shake, but every instinct in me was suddenly aware that I had crossed a line I could not easily step back over. Behind me, Dylan Carter did not react immediately, at least not in any way that the rest of the room could notice, and that silence was somehow worse than any visible response. I busied myself with a tray of empty glasses, pretending to belong to the rhythm of the restaurant again, but my thoughts kept circling the same point. He had read the note. I knew he had read it. I could feel it in the way the space around his table had tightened, like everything there was now being measured differently. Minutes passed, though it felt longer, and then I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Dylan had not stood up, had not caused a scene, had not changed his expression in any obvious way. Instead, he leaned slightly back in his chair, one hand resting near his glass of water, the other holding my note between two fingers as if it weighed nothing. His gaze did not go to Vanessa immediately. It came first to me. Even from across the room, even while I was supposed to be invisible, I felt that look land with precise awareness, as if he had already mapped every possible reason I might have done what I did. Then, slowly, he unfolded the note. No rush, no surprise, just controlled attention, the kind that suggested the information inside it was already being compared against something he had been expecting. Vanessa was still speaking to the man across from her, her smile intact, her posture relaxed, but I noticed now that her hand was no longer resting on the table. It had moved slightly under it, as if she was waiting for something unseen to happen. Dylan did not interrupt her. He simply set the note down beside his glass and said something to one of the men at his table in a voice too low for me to hear. The man nodded once and stood, leaving the room without drawing attention. That alone told me more than any reaction could have. Dylan's eyes moved back to Vanessa, and for the first time since he entered the restaurant, his expression changed just slightly, not into anger, not into shock, but into something quieter and far more unsettling. Recognition. As if what I had written had not informed him of something new, but confirmed something already in motion. I felt my throat tighten because that meant I had not revealed a secret to him. I had stepped into the middle of one. Vanessa finally noticed the shift. Her laughter faded mid-sentence, her eyes flicking toward Dylan's table, then briefly toward me. And in that second, I saw her understand that something had broken the surface. She excused herself from the conversation, her movements still controlled, but no longer effortless. Dylan did not stop her. He watched her stand, watched her adjust her jacket, watched her take one step away from the table. Only then did he speak, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for her to hear. She froze immediately. I could not hear the words, but I saw the effect. The way her shoulders tightened, the way her confidence faltered for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. And then Dylan's attention returned, not to her, but to me again, across the room, through the noise, through the movement of servers and guests and clinking glass. It was direct, undeniable, not gratitude, not warning, something far more controlled, as if he had just confirmed I was no longer an observer. I was now part of the equation. For a moment after Dylan Carter's gaze found me again, I told myself it was coincidence, the kind of paranoid thought that comes from working too many late shifts and standing too long on polished floors that reflect everything except certainty. But coincidence does not feel like pressure. Coincidence does not feel like being measured in silence. I returned to the service station with my hands moving automatically, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, doing everything I had done 1,000 times before, yet none of it felt familiar anymore. Every step I took felt like it had a second meaning attached to it that I had not agreed to understand. Vanessa had not returned to her seat. That absence mattered more than I wanted it to. The man she had been speaking with was also gone now, and the space they had occupied looked wrong, like a sentence missing its ending. I tried to focus on the noise of the restaurant, the clatter of dishes, the soft rise of conversation, the distant hum of city traffic outside the glass walls, but all of it felt thin compared to the stillness I kept sensing from Dylan's table. I did not look directly at him at first, but I felt him observing the room the way someone studies a map before deciding where to move next. Then my manager passed me near the service corridor and leaned in, his voice low and sharp, telling me to stay away from table 7. That was Dylan's table. I asked nothing. That was rule number 1 here. You do not ask questions that might already have answers you cannot afford to hear. Still, I found myself slowing down whenever I passed near that section, pretending to adjust silverware or check a table number. Anything that gave me a reason to be closer without appearing to be. That was when I noticed something had changed again. Dylan was no longer sitting. He stood near the edge of his table, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, his posture calm, but no longer passive. The man who had left earlier had not returned. Instead, another of his associates had taken his place, speaking briefly into a phone before nodding once and stepping away from the room. Vanessa reappeared at the far end of the dining area, but she was no longer smiling. Her steps were slower now, measured in a way that suggested she was aware of timing rather than comfort. She stopped near the bar, her eyes scanning the room until they locked briefly with Dylan's. No one else seemed to notice the exchange, but I did. It was not long, not dramatic, just enough to carry meaning that did not belong in a public space. Dylan did not move toward her. Instead, he reached for his glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with precise control. Then he turned slightly, and for the first time since I had entered his line of sight, I realized he was not simply reacting to events. He was arranging them. I felt my chest tighten because that realization changed everything about how I understood the room. Vanessa took one step backward, then another, as if something had shifted beneath her that she could no longer balance on. Dylan's gaze followed her, steady and unreadable, and then, unexpectedly, it shifted again, directly to me. Not briefly this time. Not by accident. It held. I stopped moving without realizing I had done it, tray still in my hand, mid-step between tables. The entire restaurant continued around us, but that space between us felt separated from it, like a quiet line had been drawn that no one else could see. I did not know what he was thinking. I only knew I had become part of whatever he was already preparing long before I wrote that note. And for the first time since the night began, I understood something I could not yet name. Whatever was coming next was not going to happen around me. It was going to include me. I did not realize I was holding my breath until my lungs started to burn slightly, and when I finally exhaled, it felt like I had been underwater for far too long without noticing. Dylan Carter was still looking at me, but now there was something different in the way his attention held its shape. It was no longer passive observation. It felt like confirmation. Vanessa had moved again, this time toward the edge of the main dining area where the lighting was lower and the conversations quieter. She kept her posture steady, but I noticed small details now that I had not paid attention to before. The way her eyes kept scanning exits, the way her fingers touched her phone without actually using it. Dylan did not follow her immediately. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, as if giving the room time to reveal itself on its own terms. One of his associates returned briefly, leaned down, spoke a few words I could not hear, and then stepped back as if waiting for instruction. Dylan nodded once, a subtle movement that carried more authority than anything spoken aloud in the entire restaurant that night. I told myself I should stop watching. That was the rational thing to do. But rational thoughts were becoming harder to maintain inside a situation that no longer behaved rationally. I turned away, pretending to adjust a nearby table setting, but I could still feel the direction of everything shifting behind me. Vanessa stopped walking. That was the first change. Not because she chose to, but because something in the room had forced her rhythm to break. Dylan finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the kind of calm that suggested every step had already been decided in advance. He crossed a few feet toward the center aisle, and suddenly every server in that area became aware of him, even without looking directly. There is a difference between noticing someone and feeling them enter your space, and that was what it felt like. He stopped near a column that separated the dining floor from the bar section. From there, he could see everything without being in the center of anything. That position alone told me more than anything else had. Vanessa turned slightly, as if sensing him behind her, and for the first time her composure slipped just enough for me to see uncertainty replace control. I felt my pulse tighten because I realized I was no longer watching a conversation unfold. I was watching positions being evaluated. Dylan's gaze moved briefly across the room again, and for a fraction of a second it landed on me once more, not as a warning, not as curiosity, but as if I had already been accounted for in a larger calculation. Then he spoke, quietly, to one of his men who had just arrived near the entrance. The man did not respond verbally, only gave a short nod and stepped back outside through the glass doors. Vanessa tried to move again, but her path was no longer open in the way it had been earlier. She slowed, stopped, then turned slightly as if reconsidering something she had already committed to. I could feel the tension rising in a way that did not rely on volume or visible confrontation. It was structural, like the room itself was being reorganized without anyone announcing it. I pressed my tray closer to my body, suddenly aware of how small my role was in all of this, and yet how close I had come to stepping directly into its center. Dylan did not look away from the space between him and Vanessa for long. When he finally did, it was to glance at his phone, which had just lit up briefly in his hand. His expression did not change, but something in his focus narrowed. Vanessa took one more step backward, and this time I knew it was not voluntary. Whatever had been set in motion before I wrote, that note was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time, and I was still standing inside it. I was starting to understand something uncomfortable about power, not the kind that shouted or threatened, but the kind that reorganized reality without needing permission from anyone inside it. Dylan Carter stood near the center column as if the restaurant had been built around his awareness rather than the other way around. And even without hearing him clearly, I could tell he was no longer reacting to events, but guiding them toward an outcome that already existed in his mind. Vanessa had stopped moving entirely now. She was no longer trying to maintain the illusion of a normal evening. Her posture had shifted into something tighter, more controlled, like someone who suddenly realized the ground beneath them had changed shape. I watched her scan the room once more, slower this time, and when her eyes landed on Dylan, she did not look away quickly enough to pretend she was unaffected. Dylan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply tilted his head slightly, a gesture so small I almost missed it, and yet it carried enough weight that even the surrounding staff seemed to feel it without understanding why. I moved closer to the service station again, pretending to organize napkins, but my attention kept drifting back because something about the balance of the room was no longer stable. Vanessa took a step toward the hallway that led to the private dining corridor, then paused, as if reconsidering the direction entirely. That pause told me more than movement ever could. Dylan finally shifted his attention away from her and looked down at his phone again. The brief light from the screen reflected across his face, revealing nothing except calm focus. A moment later, one of his associates returned through the glass entrance, leaned in, and spoke quietly. Dylan listened, without interruption, then placed his phone back on the table. When he stood this time, it was different. Not abrupt, not dramatic, but final in a way that suggested a decision had already been executed elsewhere. Vanessa noticed immediately. I saw it in the way her shoulders tightened and her eyes widened slightly before she forced them steady again. Dylan began walking, not toward her directly, but toward the space between her and the exit. It was not a confrontation. It was positioning. Every step he took reduced the distance in a way that felt inevitable rather than aggressive. I found myself unable to look away, even though every rational part of me told me I should disappear back into the kitchen and stay there. Vanessa tried to move toward the opposite direction, but the flow of the room seemed to adjust around Dylan's movement, subtly blocking her path without anyone explicitly doing anything. That realization made my stomach tighten because it meant this was no longer about conversation or misunderstanding. It was structure, control, outcome. Dylan stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that they could speak without raising their voices. I could not hear the words, but I could see the effect immediately. Vanessa's expression shifted, not into fear exactly, but into something closer to recognition, like she had just been reminded of a detail she had hoped would never surface. Dylan's gaze remained steady, unreadable, and entirely without urgency. Around them, the restaurant continued to pretend nothing unusual was happening, but I no longer believed that illusion. I realized then that my note had not changed the situation. It had only confirmed which version of it was already in motion. And as Dylan's attention briefly shifted across the room once more, I felt it settle on me again, not as accident, not as curiosity, but as acknowledgement, as if I had just been marked as someone who could no longer stand outside of what came next. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like a restaurant and started feeling like a controlled space, not because anything visible changed, but because everything invisible had already shifted into place. Dylan Carter was still standing near Vanessa Reed, close enough for conversation, but far enough that it did not feel like a conversation anymore. It felt like an assessment. Vanessa's composure was still there, carefully constructed, but I could see the strain in how she held her posture, like someone maintaining balance on a surface that was no longer steady. Dylan's expression had not changed in any dramatic way, yet the absence of change itself was the most unsettling part. He was listening, but not reacting, and that made it impossible to tell whether anything she said mattered to him at all. I found myself stepping back toward the service corridor again, but not because I was told to move, more because staying still suddenly felt like being exposed. My manager passed behind me, whispering for staff to avoid the main floor, and I realized that even the employees who had nothing to do with the situation were now being gently redirected away from it. That alone confirmed it was not a normal misunderstanding. Dylan raised his hand slightly, not pointing, not signaling sharply, just a minimal gesture that caused one of his associates to reposition himself near the exit without drawing attention. It was so subtle that most guests would never notice, yet every movement in the room seemed to align after it. Vanessa spoke again, and I could see her trying to reclaim control of the conversation, but Dylan tilted his head a fraction, and she stopped mid-sentence. Not because he interrupted her verbally, but because she understood she had reached the limit of what she could redirect. I noticed then that the man she had been coordinating with earlier was no longer visible anywhere in the dining area. That absence felt heavier than his presence had been. Dylan finally stepped closer, reducing the distance between them by a single pace, and I saw Vanessa's eyes flick briefly toward the side exits again, calculating something quickly. But the calculation did not last. Dylan's voice, when he finally spoke, was low enough that I could not hear the words, yet the effect was immediate. Vanessa's shoulders tightened, and for the first time her expression fractured just slightly, not into panic, but into recognition of consequence. I pressed myself closer to the corridor entrance, pretending to check the seating chart, but my focus was locked entirely on them. This was no longer about suspicion or uncertainty. It had become something precise, like a system executing steps in order. Dylan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The way he stood, the way he paused between words, the way he controlled distance itself, made every action feel deliberate and final. Vanessa attempted one more shift in posture, a subtle step backward, but she stopped when she realized there was nowhere left for her to reposition without acknowledgement. Dylan's gaze held steady, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to fully understand before. He was not discovering betrayal in real time. He was confirming its boundaries. And somewhere in that realization, I understood that my note had not warned him of danger. It had simply told him where it was already standing. I should have walked away when I still had the chance, when the situation was still something happening near me instead of something slowly closing around me. But by then, it was already too late to pretend I was just a waitress doing her job. Dylan Carter had not moved in a dramatic way, not once since he stepped closer to Vanessa Reed. Yet every small shift in his position carried the weight of finality, like decisions being made without the need for explanation. Vanessa was no longer speaking. That was the first real change. Her voice had faded completely, replaced by a stillness that looked forced, like she was holding herself together by effort alone. Dylan stood a few feet away from her, his posture calm, his attention locked on something only he could fully see. I stayed near the corridor entrance, pretending to adjust a service cart, but my focus refused to leave the center of the room. The restaurant had not emptied, yet it felt like distance had been created between every table and the space Dylan occupied, as if the world itself was giving him room to finish what had already begun. Vanessa finally spoke again, but whatever she said did not hold for long. I saw it in her face immediately after, the moment she realized the response she expected was not the one she received. Dylan did not react outwardly, not with anger, not with surprise, but with something far more unsettling, recognition without hesitation. It was the expression of someone confirming details already known, not discovering them. One of his associates appeared near the entrance again, paused briefly beside Dylan, and spoke in a tone too low for anyone else to hear. Dylan gave a single nod, and the associate disappeared just as quietly as he arrived. That movement alone shifted the energy of the room again, subtle but undeniable. Vanessa turned her head slightly toward the bar area, then toward the exit path behind her, and I realized she was no longer trying to maintain composure for appearance. She was calculating distance. Dylan finally looked directly at her, and I felt something tighten in my chest because the silence between them suddenly carried more meaning than anything that had been said all night. He stepped closer, not rushing, not forcing, just reducing space in a way that made the environment itself feel smaller. Vanessa did not retreat immediately, but but she also did not move forward. She was suspended in a decision she could no longer fully control. I noticed guests beginning to sense something. Not clearly, not consciously, but in the way conversations softened and attention drifted toward the center without understanding why. Dylan spoke again, still too quiet for me to hear, but this time Vanessa's reaction was immediate. Her shoulders dropped slightly, as if a structure she had been holding up had finally given way. There was no visible confrontation, no chaos, nothing that would draw obvious attention, yet I understood more clearly than before that this was not an argument. It was resolution. Dylan's gaze moved briefly across the room again, and for the first time since I had written the note, I did not feel like I was watching the situation unfold from the outside. I felt like I had already been placed within its boundaries. When his eyes found me, there was no surprise in them anymore, only acknowledgement, as if my role had already been accounted for in whatever conclusion he was now reaching. I did not realize how quietly a situation can reach its final shape until there is nothing left to adjust, nothing left to interpret differently. Only the certainty that whatever is going to happen has already been set in motion. Dylan Carter stood in the same place for a moment longer, his attention no longer divided between Vanessa Reed and the room, but fully settled into something final and resolved. Vanessa was no longer speaking at all. Her silence now felt heavier than anything she had said earlier, because it no longer carried confidence or negotiation, only the absence of options she thought she had. I stayed near the service corridor, my hands still resting on the edge of a cart I had not moved in minutes, pretending that I was still part of the restaurant routine, but I was no longer inside it. I was watching something unfold that no longer needed participation to continue. Dylan finally took one step forward, not toward Vanessa directly, but into the space that separated her from any direction she had been considering. That single step changed everything about how the room felt, because it removed the illusion that there were multiple outcomes left available. Vanessa's head turned slightly, and I saw it then, not panic, not confusion, but acceptance forming in real time, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer negotiating with a situation, but standing inside its conclusion. Dylan spoke again, and even though I could not hear the words, I could see their effect immediately. Vanessa's shoulders lowered, not in relief, but in resignation, as if a structure she had been maintaining quietly for a long time had finally stopped holding. One of Dylan's associates appeared near the entrance again, paused briefly, and exchanged a short acknowledgement before stepping away without drawing attention. That movement confirmed what I had begun to understand earlier. Nothing about this was improvisation. Everything had been coordinated in layers I was never meant to see. Vanessa looked once toward the bar, once toward the exit, and then stopped moving altogether. There was no more calculation in her expression, only the recognition that whatever path she had prepared no longer existed in a usable form. Dylan did not look at her again immediately. Instead, his attention shifted slowly across the room, passing over guests who continued their conversations without understanding that something fundamental had already changed in their environment. And then his eyes found mine again. This time there was no ambiguity in them, no assessment, no curiosity. It was acknowledgement, not of what I had seen, but of what I had already become inside this sequence of events. I felt it in that moment, a quiet but absolute understanding that my note had not interrupted anything. It had simply placed me inside something that was already closing around its final shape, and Dylan Carter had already decided exactly where I belonged within it. I remember the exact moment everything shifted from observation to inevitability, not because anything loud happened, but because silence itself began to feel structured, like it had edges and direction. Dylan Carter stood in the same position for a brief moment longer, and then he moved. Not toward Vanessa Reed, not toward the exits. He moved as if the room no longer contained separate people, only positions within a design only he could fully see. Vanessa did not step back this time. She simply stopped trying to adjust her expression at all. Whatever confidence she had been holding together earlier had now been replaced by stillness, the kind that comes when effort no longer changes outcome. I was still near the service corridor, my body technically in motion, but my attention completely locked on what was unfolding. I had written a note thinking I was interrupting something dangerous. I was beginning to understand I had only confirmed something already completed in principle. Dylan's associate returned once more, this time not approaching him directly, but stopping at a respectful distance, delivering a short message before stepping away again. Dylan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Vanessa for a long moment that carried no visible emotion, only finality. Then he spoke, and whatever he said did not raise tension or create reaction in the way I expected. It did the opposite. It settled the situation. Vanessa's posture changed subtly, her shoulders lowering in a controlled release, like someone acknowledging that resistance was no longer part of the available options. I noticed her eyes move once more toward the side of the room, but the motion was slower now, less strategic, more reflexive. The exits no longer looked like opportunities. They looked like distance that no longer mattered. Dylan finally turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough for his attention to extend across the room again. That was when I felt it more clearly than before. It was not just that he was aware of me. It was that I was no longer external to what was happening. I had been integrated into it. My earlier assumption that I was an observer no longer held any structure. Everything in the room seemed to confirm that without saying it aloud. Vanessa stood completely still now, and I realized there was nothing left for her to negotiate. No change in posture, no adjustment in tone, no decision she could still make that would alter what was already set. Dylan's gaze returned to her briefly, then shifted again, and for a fraction of a second I felt the same acknowledgement I had felt before, but deeper this time, as if the distance between my action and his understanding had completely collapsed. I was not being evaluated anymore. I was being placed, not as a participant in the events, but as a defined element within them. And in that quiet realization, I understood something I could not step away from even if I wanted to. My decision had not changed the direction of the night. It had only revealed that I had been standing inside its path from the very beginning.